Welcome to the Opt-in podcast. I am so excited to welcome our guest here on the show today, Cynthia Corsetti. We just talked about me messing up names. Is here with us today. She is an executive coach. She is a business owner, so she's an entrepreneur, and she is an author of a book that is going to be coming out later this year. It is available for purchase right now called Dark Drivers. Cynthia is joining us today to talk all about her book, what inspired her to become an author and to get this out into the world, and why we all need to pay attention to our dark drivers and do some work around it. So, Cynthia, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm really excited to be here.
I am looking forward to our conversation. We are full of transparency in this podcast. So for all of my listeners, I haven't read the book yet. And so I'm coming into this conversation as a engaged learner as much as the rest of you. So hopefully the questions I ask will be things that help everybody get inspired and want to know more and dive into the book. I'm very excited to pre-order my copy and dig into it. We'll probably have Cynthia back after I'm able to do that, and we can dive into all of the questions that I'll have as it comes up. But Cynthia, maybe before we get started on the book, for everybody to get to know a little bit about you, who's Cynthia? How did you develop this career? Tell us a little bit about you.
So, I'm Cynthia Corsetti, and I started my executive coaching business about 15 years ago. But prior to that, I was corporate. I was an executive vice president of human resources in a national engineering firm. I had been through multiple different careers in my time. I always tease that I was like, my generation is like, I was too late for that, like Mad Men stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not that old, but also before the Me Too movement. So we were like right in between, and navigating my career as a female was challenging. And then, I was in an all-male engineering environment. So it was kind of interesting, but I learned a lot. And when I left there, that's when I decided to start my executive coaching business. And I specialize in working with C-suite executives or high potentials who are on their way to the C-suite.
It sounds like a fascinating time to have a career, especially inside of an engineering company where I'm sure at the executive level, you were one of few in the room, and probably saw at least the trend that I still see that's very common, that HR and maybe legal have a woman sitting in the seat, and the rest of the table around you is men staring at you.
Yeah, I think it's changing now. That was 20 years ago when I was in there. And back then it was still okay for the CEO to say something like in a meeting, like, hey, can you use your big girl voice if he couldn't hear me, which is like totally not okay now. But things have changed, and now there are a lot of women really going places in those kinds of organizations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So with all of that knowledge and expertise, you entered into this coaching business where you were working with aspiring C-suite and those in the C-suite that wanted to grow and develop their skills. And because you've kind of hit the place in your journey where you've now authored a book, I'm guessing that you saw some trends or some patterns that kind of came to light. So what did you start to see as you worked with these individuals over the course of your career that kind of led you down the path to the topic that we're going to discuss today?
It's interesting because the executives that I work with are all super high potential people, or not high potential, high achievers and high potentials. And so they're at the top of their game. And yet there are patterns. There are, for example, one of my clients was a PhD, brilliant person who he's moving up in his organization, and he's at this executive level, and yet no one wanted to work with him because he always had to have the last word. He got obnoxious. So there was like that trend. And then I would have others who would become extremely defensive or, argumentative, or have to have a lot of bravado. And I started to really notice that as I dug into these people, they all had something in common. And that's where the book and that and my own experience combined became the title and the concept of the book.
So as you've been working with these clients and kind of, I think in some lanes, personal development, maybe we would even call some of these limiting beliefs. How do you see dark drivers as something that's different than a limiting belief or any of kind of the other nomenclature that we love to use kind of out there to pinpoint something that we don't want to call a strength or a weakness or an opportunity, as we like to coin the phrases as well? How are those things a little bit different?
So I like to say that there's a lot of stuff out there. There's a lot of good books, leadership books, and we have Start With Why from Simon Sinek, and we have Good to Great, we have Lean In, we have the really, really good books. But my concept is none of them will do you any good at all until you've read Dark Drivers, because you can't lead anything or anyone until you figure out your own dark drivers. And what a dark driver is it is a trigger. It is a blind spot, possibly the way it shows up at work. It may show up as an emotional trigger or becoming defensive or whatever we might see. But what it really comes from is a past experience, memory, or trauma. And I use the word trauma lightly because it doesn't necessarily have to mean like you were sexually abused as a child to have trauma. But we assign meanings to the things that happen to us. So if we're a small child, for example, and you are 4 years old and you wander into your parents' bedroom at 5 a.m. and your parents want to go back to sleep. And they go, get out of here, go back to bed, leave, let us have 30 more minutes. And that to that 4-year-old, they very likely could think they're not wanted at that moment. And they go back to bed, they lay down, but that memory sticks with them. And then their subconscious looks for proof of that over the years. So then that 4-year-old is now 6 and they're on the playground and one of the kids don't want to play with them. And it just validates that false memory because a 4-year-old assigned meaning to it, right? Mm-hmm. So this keeps building and they just get buried. And all of these memories and all of these experiences are with us every day. So I like to say that they're like a million little beach balls that we're holding under the water. And at any time, one of them can pop up and smack us in the face. So the example I gave you of the PhD brilliant guy that no one wanted to work with because he always had to have the last word. He became very obnoxious. Well, when we really dug in to his dark drivers, he was the youngest of 7 siblings. He was never able to be heard. He always felt like he had to prove himself. And once he identified that was what was actually driving his behavior in the boardroom, he would say to me, he goes, Cynthia, I literally would walk out of a meeting and say, okay, that was the 6-year-old. Now the adult's going to take over and go back in. So you have a lot of control once you identify what memories are making these triggers happen.
That is a great explanation and kind of a good illustration to something small that can happen as a child and then just, kind of is carried with you through all of your life experiences. One of the things that you mentioned as you were telling that story was it's a moment in time that happens and then you perceive the narrative repeating itself in a variety of circumstances over a lifetime. So with dark drivers, do you often see it's not just a moment in time, but it really is something that happens. And then as you're living your life experiences, it kind of compounds before it gets to, the point that you identified, example with your PhD. Is that how that works?
Yeah, because the human memory is like there's all these different phases to human memory, and one of those things is encoding, and so we assign meaning like we did at 4, but our subconscious also recognized that physical feeling inside of us. And even if we're a small child at the time, like we didn't make the cheerleading squad, or it feels huge to us at that time, and we never want to experience that feeling again. That feeling of so the subconscious like looks to protect us in that, and in order to do that, it'll say, oh, this could be that again, and just, you're not good enough, don't go for that, you really do need, you're not being heard, you need to speak up. And that's all it is trying to protect that piece of us, because we validated it over and over and over throughout the years.
So interesting. And I would imagine, because we all love to live in a little bit of the sea of denial, that there's a good amount of people out there that say, I had a great life. There wasn't anything bad that happened. I don't think this doesn't apply to me. I'm going to stop the podcast now. It will help somebody else that's had a lot of struggle and challenges. So what do you say to those people that come at it from the point of view of, from my perspective, I don't see anything that would create these underlying triggers?
Yeah, it's kind of funny, because I have a client who says that, she's like, I had a great life. And at the same time, I know for a fact that I know this client's background, and I know that she was the oldest child in her family. And I know that her parents got divorced when she was very young, and she took over parenting, for the most part, her younger siblings. And now in her role at work, some of her struggles are that she overcompensates, she overmanages, she kind of, they call her mom at work, kind of jokingly. And it's sabotaging her career in some ways. Now, she and I can talk about those symptoms and those habits, and we can retrain her. But until she identifies the fact that, she felt, and she's told me this, she felt very abandoned by her parents at that time. And even though they were great, and they, co-parented and lived down the street from each other, and from the outside, she perceives everything was great, that small feeling of abandonment and having to take over and be perfect, it stuck with her, and it's still affecting her work. So I use the term dark drivers because they're kind of hidden in the recesses of our mind. It doesn't necessarily mean it's this big evil thing that had to happen to us, but it's like puppet strings. They are causing us to make choices and decisions, failed relationships. For myself, before I figured out my own dark drivers, I left relationships. I just left because I better do that, because if I don't, they will. And once I figured it out, it was like a switch flipped on.
And is it possible that at certain points in time, these drivers could have actually served you for an end purpose? So is it possible that at some point, because as we talked about the encoding and kind of the repeated patterns, that it's possible that earlier on in your life or in a different scenario, that mindset or that belief that you had did help you overcome or get an achievement. And then as you grow and develop your career and pivot and shift and move and your life changes, that it's now stop holding you back. Is there the case where at one point it was helpful, and then the next breath, so to speak, when circumstances changes, it's causing this limit?
Yeah, I think so. But I also think that sometimes it's helpful, even though it's happening unconsciously, right? And these beliefs are leading us in a certain direction, and maybe those things work out. But if we can become aware of them, we can utilize them for a benefit. And so we never have to worry about it not being helpful.
That makes a lot of sense. Kind of turn it into your superpower, so to speak.
They're not going to go away. The analogy I use in the book is if you were to imagine that your life is a bus. It could be a Greyhound bus. It could be a school bus. It could be any bus that you can conjure into your mind. And that bus pulls up and you step onto the bus. And you look at all the seats in the bus, and every single seat is filled with a different passenger. But all those passengers are versions of you. So the one passenger is the one that, didn't get into the advanced math program. And the other passenger is the one who took care of her grandmother when she was on her deathbed. And the other version. So these are all different versions of you. Some are very weak and some are very strong. And they're not going anywhere because they're all part of your past and part of what makes you you. But when you realize you have the power is when you step on that bus and you look back at all of these passengers, you can say, okay, for this situation, like I can't have this weak person who didn't get in the advanced math driving the bus right now because I'm going up for this really big promotion. So I need a stronger version of me to drive. And when you realize you have that power, it's very empowering to know that you actually have more control of who's driving the bus at any given time.
More awareness, and you're more conscious kind of how you're showing up and representing in a given scenario based on what you've also been able to demonstrate to yourself over time, right?
Right.
So pulling on those memories. So without giving all of the secrets of the book away, because we want them to buy the book and read the book and do all the things. If I wanted to do some work now and start to work on my dark drivers, like where do you start? Once you say, this is interesting to me, I want to dig a little bit deeper, I think there's probably something here. How would I start without your assistance? I'm a C-suite executive, so I guess I could hire you and you and I could do the work. But if I was, not ready for your services and really just kind of saying, I want to dig into this and really get started, where would I start? What would I do from a self-reflection standpoint to be able to figure out what some of my dark drivers are?
I think the important thing is to start looking at patterns in your life. How you handle there's often a carryover between career and personal life. So if you find that you get bored in jobs and you quit jobs and you never feel satisfied in a job, and you get bored in relationships, you quit relationships, like that's a pattern. It might be a pattern of like you when you get nervous, you like to go shopping, or and we attribute a lot of these things. Everyone's ADHD right now, and so we'll attribute some of these things. But the key is to try to find patterns in your behavior, and long-term patterns. And when you can start identifying those long-term patterns, that's when you're going to start to become aware that maybe I'm not as consciously aware of my behavior as I think I am.
And then what do you do next? So let's say an example that I use a lot, in fact, I did a podcast about this a few weeks ago, is that I'm a reformed corporate bragger. So early on in my career, I was one of those people. And then when other people started doing it, I realized it drove me crazy, and then realized that I was doing it myself. And, so that's self-fulfilling prophecy. But I would be the one that would, say things like, I worked until 10 o'clock last night, or I worked the whole weekend, and it was hindsight being 2020 was my way of communicating, like, I'm better than all of you because I'm sacrificing my life. Right. And using the analogy that you had a little bit, or not analogy, the story that you had about the female executive, I come from a divorced household and had to step up and, figure out how to pay for college and like do all of these things. And so all of that was really tied together. I had to really do a ton of what would have been considered sacrifice. I didn't go away to college the way that my friends did. I worked full time. I had my own health benefits at 18, right? And so when I got into the corporate setting, that manifested in me kind of shouting from the rooftops all the things I was sacrificing for the greater good because I couldn't do it in my house. And then I realized it, and I switched the behavior and I stopped doing it. I also, by the way, stopped killing myself because that wasn't serving anybody either. And luckily I learned that lesson at about 24. So it slowed down. But, what do you do once you identify, I identified the behavior. I was like, God, it drives me crazy every time that guy says how late he worked. It is so annoying. Just don't tell me. So when you get to that point of awareness, then what do you do? How do you, is this something where you identify the pattern and then you reach out to your leader and ask for help, or a trusted mentor and say, I'm noticing this thing. Can you help me work through it? What would be your next step?
So I want to start by saying like there's a fine line between therapy and coaching, right? So depending on how deep this pattern is and so on, you may want it to call a therapist. If you're working with a coach, or if you're trying to want to work on it on your own, right? One of the tools that I use is part of NLP, Neurolinguistic programming. But basically, it's just trying to take a walk backwards in time. So you start with the present time and what triggered you right now. And you know, what made you feel like you needed to tell everyone that I worked, 14 hours yesterday? Why did you feel that? And then when's like the earliest time you can remember having to do that or feeling that need to do that? What was going on in your life then? And we keep trying to go back further and further to the earliest memory. And that's when, like the other story that I told you about the youngest of 7 siblings, like when he traced it all the way back, he goes, oh my gosh, like I can remember it like it was yesterday, but that just became ingrained in me and how I'm supposed to be. And it's not true. That's how this 7-year-old perceived life in one way. He's not being heard. Meanwhile, they didn't probably know he was there. It wasn't they didn't want him. He was 7, whatever. So you have to go back until you can remember the very first time you remember it. And a lot of times that's all it takes, because then you can separate yourself from that time to the present and you become empowered.
That makes a lot of sense. And definitely, I think the advice was sound. Depending on what you're dealing with, you may need different types of professionals. You may need a career coach for one topic, and you may need a licensed therapist for something else, just depending on what you've dug up, right? Or what you've been able to trace things back to. I can imagine that as these books get in everybody's hands and people get excited, and I, who am a leader and tend to do this often with my teams, leaders are going to go out there and they're going to pick up your book, they're going to read it, they're going to get excited, and then they're also going to say, and I know exactly who needs this because it will fix them. Which is probably not the approach that we want to take. So how should leaders use what you're teaching in Dark Drivers inside of their organizations?
I think it's funny that you asked that, because like the book right now, the manuscript is done and I'm in the revisions. And one of the things I'm really trying to be careful of is that exact thing, because I've read my fair share of leadership books and you try to make them applicable. I think the biggest lesson a leader can learn is to uncover their own dark drivers and to recognize how it impacts their behavior. So when their subordinate comes to them and they're struggling with something, or they're acting like an idiot and the leader's going, oh, that's something from her childhood. Like, use that for empathy. Use that to understand that person in front of you has all these beach balls and something triggered it. So as a leader, it's your job to kind of be aware of when you're triggering someone or when someone is triggered. So how can you back up the conversation? How can you diffuse what's happening? And, and you're not supposed to be their therapist, but you are supposed to help them. As a leader, your job is to help them become better leaders. So when you're noticing that as, a trigger, diffuse it at the time, and then maybe later just approach them and say, hey, I noticed that, you seem like you were uncomfortable there. Is there any way I can support you in that? Without delving in and trying to be their therapist, give them space to start to recognize it themselves. Yeah, maybe I was uncomfortable. At least it starts that, and you have empathy as a leader.
That's really good advice. I think leaders today, with the multi-generational landscape that they have, and these young workers that we have coming into the workforce for the first time, that frankly, none of us really understand what they had to go through to get there. We've got lots of college graduates or future college graduates that had their social world and their educational world disrupted by a global pandemic. And we don't know, what lasting effects that's going to have. And the line between professional feedback-based conversations and caring and feeding for the emotional well-being of the employee is really starting to blur. And I think that we saw that in 2020. We all hoped it was going to balance itself, by now when the pandemic ended. And what we're starting to experience is this new normal where the wall came down a bit. And we really kind of blended the leadership approach, and that we needed to care for the whole human. So I liked the story that you told around where the line is in these conversations, because what I could see happening, and maybe you've seen this happen with some of your clients, is that as you develop these skills for yourself and you have all of this awareness, you can actually blur the line a little too far with the employees, also making them a bit uncomfortable because you're now delving into, these realms of places where people don't want you to dig. So I really appreciated that you focused on resolve the trigger, figure out what's cropping up for you as that's coming through. And then when you have the feedback session, really just focus on what you observed from a behavioral perspective and discuss that.
Yeah, it's pretty critical that we do that, especially now. Like you said something really important, and I think I wrote a blog on this a while back, but it's like there's the concept of the next mass shooter might be in the cubicle beside you. And because we all are carrying this baggage. So we have to look at each other as humans first. And in doing that, it is a matter of learning empathy at a different level. And the only way you can do that is to learn to have empathy for yourself, to recognize your own behavior. Everything that I do in my company, we have 4 pillars of leadership: clarity, authenticity, responsibility, and engagement. So it's care to lead. But every single thing we do, we start within. Like, you figure it out for yourself, get clear on who you are, get clear on your own vision, your own mission, your own values, get clear on your own triggers and dark drivers, get clear on all of that before you can even begin to have empathy for someone else. And you cannot lead unless you master empathy. And it's not sympathy. It's not being a doormat. It is understanding that we're all human and helping the people that you lead learn to navigate in the world we live in our human state.
And so for leaders, as they're reading the book and they're doing the work and identifying their drivers and navigating the waters, it has me wonder where vulnerability comes into play with this topic. I know that there's a lot of perspectives out there in the world. I think even Simon Sinek has talked about it a bit, that when a leader is vulnerable, they build psychological safety in the team, and it allows this work to kind of further propagate. So do you advocate that as a leader is going through and identifying their dark drivers and doing the work and making changes, that they share that experience with the team? Or do you see that more as an individual endeavor and the team will just reap the rewards of the leader doing the work?
So that's an interesting question, and it's a great question. I think vulnerability is important, but you can do it. I had one CEO who we were talking about vulnerability, and he was a new CEO, so he was trying to make the people in the organization relate to him. Mm-hmm. So he sent this mass email out about, his, this tragedy that he had experienced a few years before. And people reached out to him and they're like, oh, I'm so sorry this happened. This happened to me. And he took that as building psychological safety. And it's not. More so is when the leader loses their cool or acts up in a meeting or drops the ball, and they're willing to own that mistake. That's the vulnerability that's going to show psychological safety and create psychological safety. I mean, I'm not saying that you can't ever share personal things, but they're different, right? They don't have the same purpose. So in your organization, you want to be vulnerable. You want to be human. You want to say, oh my gosh, I let that ball drop. This is 100% on me. And, we got to celebrate risk. We failed. I failed. I let you all down. That's vulnerability. That's how we build psychological safety.
That is a really profound statement. I really appreciate it because I have a lot of conversations with young leaders today that believe that if they just kind of lay it all out there, that everybody's going to trust them. And one of the conversations that we have is there's an ebb and flow between psychological safety and credibility. And being transparent that you are an ever evolving, ever growing professional human, that's wonderful. They should know that you're reading all of the books and listening to all of the podcasts or whatever it is that you're doing. And at the same time, you also have you have authority, and they need to trust and believe that you have everything in hand. And so I appreciate that example that you gave, because vulnerability I'm seeing get misconstrued sometimes, and that I'm going to go out, and have a dinner with them, and I'm going to tell them about, all of the things I'm working on, personally to better myself. And it can backfire to a certain extent. It can actually reduce your credibility because they get concerned you're distracted by all of the work that you're doing, or that it's going to impact the harmony of the team. So I really appreciated how you described that, because I think there's a delicate balance between the two.
I think so too. And I do think that if you have overcome, something in your life, that by going through that journey, there's a lesson for others in it. Like that, then it's maybe okay to share, but you don't just share for the sake of sharing. You don't just share like that, too much information. Like, I don't really need to know that, you and your wife are in therapy. It's like good to hear. But like, there's a line. Like, you want to be compassionate, you want to have empathy, but you also want to keep that professional image. And like you said, that respect.
So you've been doing all of this work. You've been seeing these dark drivers show up. You see patterns form. What inspired you to finally sit down and get the thing in a book? And how do you want people to use it when they get it in their hands?
I think what happened to have me really get this into a book was that my business is like executive coach, and then this other small piece is career coach, right? And I got the career coach piece because executives were finding themselves wanting to switch jobs, or they're not happy. They're in this thing for 20 years. I just can't do this anymore. They had no idea what they want to do. And so they get in their next job. We go through their resume. We do all this stuff. They get their next job, and they're just as miserable. And then the executives that were still in their jobs were miserable. And it was really, I was noticing this pattern, like all of them, the myth that what was making them miserable was coming from within. And they read these books, and like I said, the Start With Why, and they're like, I want to get, and we do the work with my stuff, like let's get to their core values. And you can do all of that, but it doesn't do anything until you figure this out. So that's why I said, like, all right, we got to have something that kind of breaks the mold of every other leadership book out there, because every other leadership book out there, people are taking and they're going, okay, let's go in, let's find out everyone's values in our organization. Let's set the vision. Let's set the mission. Let's lean in. And like, I'm not even doing it myself yet. I'm like screwed up on the inside. So let's start there.
It's a little bit like being on a professional development roller coaster, right? The next big bestseller comes out from somebody, you get all excited about it, you implement all of the things, you're like up right at the top peak, you think you've made it. And then 6 months later, you're down in the valley of the roller coaster again, saying, well, that crashed and burned. I don't understand what happened with that. So you're really saying that based on all of your experience, seeing that roller coaster ride kind of happening for a lot of your clients, you said, what we need to do is give them like the expert's guide before they get on the ride. This is how you enjoy the whole thing. So if you learn and do all of this and you learn all of the work here, then when you get in that ride and you buckle yourself in, whatever comes at you next, you have this foundational understanding to be able to take what you learn, and those peaks and valleys don't become so extreme.
Right. Exactly. Because there is so much good content out there. Crucial Conversations and Radical Candor, like that, there's phenomenal stuff out there. And if you really want to implement it, start here. Start by uncovering your dark drivers. Get that cleared up and then go for it, because that's when everything else is going to fall into place.
That makes so much sense. I always say that I wish the universe, because I don't want one person to do it. Maybe we could ask Oprah. She seems to be almost the universe at this point, to just kind of create a map and say, like, this is where you start. If you want to really work on professional development, like, this is where you start. And then you can pick your poison and kind of go all over the place. But here's kind of, depending on what you want to do, here's the map. Because you can walk into a bookstore, you can, walk into an airport bookstore, which is one of my favorite places to be, and be overwhelmed by the possibilities. And it can take you down rabbit holes that you're not prepared to get into if you don't have the right foundation. So I love that you're declaring kind of loud and out loud, this is the first thing, and then bring in all the rest of it. But let's start here and then really build upon it. I really like that. That's a really good way to explain it. So one of the things that I like to do in these interviews is ask everybody the same couple of questions, because I always think that it's really interesting for my listeners to kind of take them back. So I've got 3 questions for you, and I wanted to save us enough time so you could do thinking and you could expand upon it. And they should be pretty easy, so we'll see. But my first one for you is, what is the best advice that you have ever received? Professional, personal, doesn't matter, but what's the best advice that you've ever received?
Oddly enough, I think the best advice I ever received came from a manager of a restaurant when I was 16 years old, working as a waitress and failing miserably at this first waitress job. And he pulled me aside and he said, you need to learn to look at your section strategically, not one thing at a time. And because I would this person needs a Coke, I'm going to run back, I'm going to get that Coke, I'm going to come back to the table, and then I'm going to run back and get the next thing. And he pulled me aside and he said, look at it as a strategy, a little universe. And I carried that with me in every job I ever had, which helped me to think strategically, in so many different levels. When I'm dealing with a client who's struggling with something, let's be more strategic about this instead of thinking about this situation. So I think that's probably one of the best pieces of advice I've ever gotten.
That's such great advice. Such great advice. It reminds me of many years ago. I was at a hockey game and we were sitting in the great seats, at the ice. And I'm not a big hockey fan by nature. And I'm I do not understand this game at all. All they are doing is crashing into each other, getting into a fist fight, and occasionally they score. This is a mess, literally. And I'm a big sports fan, so I understand, all these things. And about a year later, we ended up in a box. So massive difference. I went from the glass, which is supposed to be the best place to be, to the box, which, has its points of view, but you can't see anything. And as I was sitting up there and I was watching them, this light bulb went off and I said, oh, there is a significant amount of strategy happening. And it was the shift in perspective that I had that allowed me to understand the big picture. And that I carry with me all of the time. When I get into the firefight, down at the very bottom and I'm at this task level and just trying to stay alive, I often go back to that image and say, no, you need to go into the box seats for a second and you need to look at all of it playing out and then figure out what your next move is. At 16, that's an amazing piece of advice to get to be able to carry with you. I wish I had learned that much earlier.
Right. Yeah.
That is amazing. Okay. So in the flip side of that, then, since we've asked for the best, what is the worst advice that you ever received?
Well, this ended up being one of my dark drivers, but the worst piece of advice I probably ever received came when my parents believed that a female's job was to be pretty, get married, and learn to type in case your husband dies or leaves you or something. So that was you grow up thinking that my role in life is different than what my role in life really was. So that was probably the worst advice, not against my parents. It was just how they,
Yeah. And you
They're
said
on
it was
dark
one of
drivers.
your dark drivers, right? So I'm sure that you had to do as you climbed the ladder and your life looked different than the image that was sanctioned by the parents. I'm sure you had to do a little bit of work there to not hold yourself back from getting where
But
you wanted to
took
go.
a lot longer because I did get married at 19. I mean, I did follow the patterns. And so I didn't even go to undergrad until I was in my 30s. So, I mean, it was a late start because of the dark drivers.
Yeah. That is a story for another day, Cynthia.
Yeah, absolutely.
When
that's
you
the
come
book.
back after the book is out in the world and I've had a chance to read it, we'll definitely talk through some of yours and how you overcame them. That sounds interesting. So the last question, the very last question I have for you is, you've lived to 120 and you are in your final days, kind of walking around the earth. What do you want your legacy to be after your full life that you've had?
She spent her life helping others be their best.
Oh, that's phenomenal. What a legacy. What a legacy.
Yeah, thank you. That's what I would like it to be.
That's amazing. All right. So I can't believe it, but we are at the end of our time already. That was such a great conversation. The book right now, as this thing airs, is available for pre-order, which for all of my listeners, in case you don't know, this is a period of time that is incredibly important to authors. So the way that it works is all of the bestseller lists, whichever one you like that you want to talk about, New York Times is an all-time favorite, the way people get on that list and the way that bookstores decide to put their books physically in the stores, how many they buy, where they place it in the store, how it's promoted on things like Amazon and other e-retailers, is all about how many books are sold on that first day of launch. And every single book that's purchased before it's available as a part of the pre-launch counts towards that first day sale. So it's really important to authors. If you're interested in this book at all, just go ahead and order it now from the link that is in the show notes. Cynthia would really appreciate it. So would I. We're going to definitely have more conversations about this as we can all get and dig in. As I said, the book is going to come out at the end of 2023. So you have plenty of time to pre-order it now, and then hopefully it will be out while you have a little holiday vacation and you'll have plenty of time to read it and get 2024 started with some good work on your dark drivers. So Cynthia, in the meantime, since we don't have the book yet, where can my folks connect with you and stay engaged with what's happening in your world?
Well, definitely LinkedIn is my happy place. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, as should any professional be these days. So connect on LinkedIn, and then my website is cynthiacorsetti.com.
Fantastic. Well, I appreciate you coming on the show today. I know my listeners are going to get a ton of value from this conversation as well as your book when it comes out. And I'm looking forward to having you back next year after we've all been able to dive in and start doing some of the work. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Melissa. I enjoyed it very much and I appreciate it.
All right. And to the opt-in listeners, this is the end of the road today. If you liked this at all, or you think somebody else would enjoy a conversation about dark drivers, please share this with your friends and professionals. And until next time, remember that you are wise, you are strong, and you are capable. And I believe in you.